Content note: this story involves historical beliefs about swapped children and mentions a real case where that belief led to harm. I keep details non-graphic and victim first. The first thing you notice is not a scream. It is the silence between breaths. A cradle in the corner, a candle shrinking. The kind of night where your house feels too big for the people inside it. You tell yourself it is just exhaustion. The baby has been crying for hours. Your eyes sting. Your hands smell like smoke and milk and fear. Then the crying stops and the quiet feels wrong. Morning comes and the face is familiar, but the feeling is not. The baby looks like your baby, yet something in you recoils, like it has touched a cold stone. In old European folklore, that feeling had a name before it had an explanation. Changeling, the child taken, the child returned wrong. The myth begins in places where loss was common and medicine was thin, where fevers came without warning, where babies could fade fast, where grief needed a shape so it could be stared down. People did not call it superstition. They called it sense. They watched a child change, and they reached for the only map they had. The old stories that said the other world lives close to our doors. In these stories, the thing that takes children is not a cartoon fairy. It is something older, something that moves like mist at the edge of the field, something that wants what humans have: warmth, names, luck. The swap is the cruelty, not simply theft, but replacement. The family is left holding a body that looks like love, while doubt begins to poison the room. Across Celtic and Germanic regions, the pattern repeats. A human child disappears. A substitute remains. Sometimes it is a fairy child. Sometimes an ancient being pressed into small bones. In German-speaking folklore, the replacement is often called Wechselbalg or Wechselkind, a swapped child by definition, a word built around exchange, like a lock built around a key. In Scandinavian tales, the swap is tied to trolls or underground beings, especially before christening, as if a blessing is a kind of fence and the first days are a gate left open. That is why the nursery becomes a battleground in the stories. The cradle is not just furniture, it is a frontier, a place where unseen hands might reach through the dark. The protection is practical because fear is practical. Iron near the baby, fire kept alive. A blade under a pillow, a charm on the door, a parent sitting upright when their body is begging to fall. These rituals did not always come from cruelty. They came from love that refused to be helpless. If you cannot cure a fever, you can at least guard the threshold. The stories give you signs to watch for: a baby that will not settle, a child who eats too much or too little, a stare that feels too old, a sudden change that turns recognition into dread. Many of these signs overlap with real conditions we understand now: colic, infection, malnutrition, developmental differences, postpartum depression, sleep deprivation. But the old world did not have those words. It had stories. And the stories did what stories do. They made suffering legible. They turned chaos into a plot. They gave families an enemy they could fight, instead of grief they could not name. The other world in changeling lore is close, not distant, not in the clouds, not under the sea. It is under a hill, behind a hedge, in the dark space between your kitchen fire and the back door. People talk about fairy mounds like they are alive. Do not disturb them. Do not cut the wrong tree. Do not take the wrong path at dusk. The rules are simple because fear likes simple rules. In many versions, the danger peaks around birth. The mother is recovering. The baby is fragile. The household is stretched thin. It is a perfect storm for a myth that says someone is watching. The fairy folk take a child for different reasons, depending on the region. Sometimes they want beauty. Sometimes they want strength. Sometimes they want luck. Sometimes they simply want what humans have because humans have it. Some traditions say the fair folk swap because their own children are sickly and they want to replace weakness with health. That detail is not random. It mirrors the fear of frailty in a world where frailty often meant death. Other traditions go colder. They say the substitute is not even a child, but something old, something left behind because the other world does not want to care for it. A cradle becomes a hiding place for age. The substitute is described as heavy in the arms, not in weight, but in feeling, like you are holding a wet coat, like the air around it is wrong, like your body recognizes a lie your eyes cannot prove. There is often one moment in the stories where the parents stop whispering and start believing. The baby laughs too sharply. The baby stares too long. The baby seems to understand words it should not. That is when the myth offers tests. The most famous ones are absurd by design. Tiny cooking, eggshells used like pots. A nonsense ritual meant to shock the substitute into reacting. When the substitute reacts in the tale, it often speaks like an adult. Not a child learning words, but an old mind forgetting to wear the mask properly. This is the lure of the changeling myth. It promises proof. It promises you can catch the lie in the act. In a world where illness offers no proof, that promise is powerful. It is important to say this clearly. Folklore is not instruction. Some historical beliefs led to harm because people treated stories as permission. This episode is here to understand, not to repeat those mistakes. The changeling myth also polices parents. It whispers that if you blink, you lose. It teaches that vigilance is morality. It makes exhaustion feel like failure. It polices mothers, especially. It warns them not to wander, not to leave the baby alone, not to be careless. In that way, the supernatural becomes a social leash. The myth also attaches itself to places that already feel tilted. Standing stones, crossroads, ruins, old forts, forest edges, places where the wind sounds like a voice when no one is there. And it attaches itself to times, the hour before midnight, the hour after midnight, the time when your body wants sleep, but your fear refuses to allow it. If you strip away the fair folk and keep the emotion, the story becomes brutally human. A parent watches a child suffer and cannot stop it. They need a reason that feels fightable. That is why changelings are often described with traits that match real illnesses: sudden weakness, endless crying, hollow eyes, lack of growth. The myth is a mirror held up to fear. In some communities, these stories became a way to talk around taboo realities: disability, mental illness, postpartum collapse, the things people could see but had no language for. The changeling myth also becomes a story about identity. The fear that a person can vanish while the body remains, that love can be tricked, that recognition is not enough. That is why there are adult changeling tales too. A spouse returns different after sickness. A familiar voice sounds wrong. A gaze becomes distant. In story form, it becomes replacement, because replacement is easier than randomness. Now we anchor this myth in a real history lesson that still chills the blood. Ireland, 1895. Bridget Cleary became ill, and her husband came to believe she was a fairy changeling. The case is documented as a murder driven by that belief. It became infamous because it happened in an era people think of as modern, and it showed how fast fear can turn folklore into violence. The reason to mention Bridget is not shock. It is a boundary marker. When a community is stressed enough, stories can become weapons. The myth becomes dangerous when people stop treating it as myth. After cases like that, changeling lore started to shift in the public imagination. It became a cautionary tale about superstition, even as the stories stayed alive in whispers and family memory. But the changeling did not disappear. It evolved. It moved into literature, into poems, into fairy tales rewritten for drawing rooms, into the soft horror of a child that feels wrong. In Scottish tradition, you hear warnings about fair folk taking infants, and you hear the same obsession with thresholds, windows, doors, the space by the hearth, the places where outside becomes inside. In Germanic regions, the language of swapping becomes sharper. The child is not changed, it is exchanged. A transaction, a theft with a receipt that no one can see. Scandinavian stories often connect the danger to the unbaptized period. Not because the child is sinful, but because the community wants a timeline where protection becomes official. And everywhere, the details point to the same living truth. The early days are fragile. The household is exhausted. The body is weak. Some versions of changeling lore describe the substitute as endlessly hungry, devouring food without gaining strength. This is famine logic, turned into a monster. Hunger personified. Other versions describe the changeling as strangely wise, like it carries an old world behind the eyes. That detail survives because it is a perfect horror, the wrong mind in the right face. The myth also interacts with community suspicion. If your child changes, the story offers a culprit, but it can also turn neighbors into witnesses and judges. Rumor becomes evidence. It is not hard to see how this spreads. One household tells the story, another listens, and suddenly the whole village is scanning cradles for signs, like fear has become a shared language. The changeling is also a warning about liminal places. A baby is liminal, not fully independent, not fully safe. A mother recovering is liminal, not fully strong, not fully healed. These are the thin places inside a home. Modern science can explain many things the changeling myth once held, but explanation does not erase emotion. A parent can know the medical reason and still feel the ancient dread in the middle of the night. That is why the myth still works on us. It does not require belief. It requires love, exhaustion, and the fear of helplessness. The changeling is grief wearing a mask that looks like your child. If you want the origins in one sentence, it is this. Changeling stories were born where people needed to explain sudden change, protect the vulnerable, and make suffering feel like it had rules. And the most haunting part is the intimacy of it. The monster is not under the bed, it is in the bed. The horror is not that something is watching you. It is that something can replace what you love. Next time you hear the word changeling, remember it is not just a fairy tale. It is a fossil of human fear, preserved in story form, from centuries where a single fever could rewrite a family overnight. Next Folklore Friday, we can follow this thread into doppelgangers, revenants, and the night hag, where the folklore becomes even more personal and even more convincing. But for now, the cradle stays in the corner, and the candle keeps shrinking, and the oldest fear in the world waits for you to look away for 1 second.